So, folks, here's a glaring, disturbing, just disgusting statistic of what's happening here in Canada. Just the disregard of our governments here in the true North Patriot love that are turning the blind eye from a serious problem affecting millions of Canadians, and that is, of course, hunger. The fact that food banks are at an all-time demand right now, the fact that supplies are not reaching to these people, and the fact that inflation on top of the cost of living crisis, on top of housing affordability, on top of many things, are putting Canadians even further and further into this state of poverty that they can't even get nourishment. And we have shown endless clips of just how disastrous it is, how the lineups at food banks are. Well, take a look at this. So we showed this video before. I'm going to just highlight it again from Wall Street Silver. When he posted this video, this is just one line at a food bank in Toronto, Ontario. Canada now has a record of 2 million people a month eating at food banks. Most of these people have jobs and can't afford the cost of living crisis in Canada. Justin Trudeau needs to go. Canada used to be a wealthy country where these things were rare. That was back in December of last year. That was December 2023 when this video came out. That number, sadly, has not changed. In fact, it's growing to an alarming rate. And now the mainstream media, like Toronto Star here, is not even trying to hide this anymore. Because the fact that you are seeing hundreds of thousands of people, upwards to millions a month, that are storming into food banks and they can't get enough, they can't get enough for their inventory. There's such a high demand that food banks and nonprofits are desperately screeching at the top of their lungs for assistance and for help, for something, before it gets even worse. So the Toronto Star points out monthly food bank usage soars to record 2 million, driven by cost of groceries and housing. Food Banks Canada recorded nearly double the monthly visits in March of 2024 compared with March of 2019. So it has nearly doubled and almost tripled just in the past few years, folks. And given the direction of our economy, given the direction of where we're standing in regards to inflation, in regards to cost of living, the fact that, prices are going up, and the fact that people cannot expect to meet the basic needs of being a Canadian citizen. They can't even get the basic survival needs of food and water and shelter. Especially people that are working. These are working individuals. This is a working class populace in Canada that are desperate for food. They're desperate just to get something into their belly so they can survive another day. And a lot of these are children. A lot of these people that are at food banks, they have families, they have children. These children are starving on the streets. Meanwhile, we have a government, we have parliamentarians that take our money and they tax us like crazy. They do the carbon tax to an outrageous number. They take that money, and instead of investing that back here to communities in Canada to actually flourish Canada and make it more prosperous for this country, they send it overseas. They send it overseas for endless warfare. They send it to lobby groups. They send it over to the WEF. They send it over to the worst of the worst people. And all it does is drain our nation completely dry. And this was what I would call a symptom of a collapsing empire. This is the sign to show that Canada is internally dying the more disregard we have for their government. The fact that our government is taking away more and more of our tax dollars, instead of investing it back here at home, instead of investing it into making sure that Canadians are safe and healthy and flourishing and prosperous in this country, they're sending it to the worst of the worst to keep the global empire alive. That is deliberately ruling against us. So here's Mark Nixon, and he pointed out Canada hits record high 2 million food bank visits in 1 month. That's 24 million per year. It took 30 years to reach 1 million and only 5 years to reach 2 million monthly users. Meanwhile, Chrystia Freeland tells Canadians, we have never had it so good in Canada. And we showed that in a previous video, in a previous segment. We talked about how people in BC bared the elements, stand in the pouring rain to get ugly potatoes, to get produce from a farm that wasn't acceptable for retail sales. So they gave it away in this charity event that they held. And people drove by the thousands to get produce because they knew that they were never going to get produce ever again with the high inflation and the high price of groceries. And it was so alarming that even Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the opposition party, called to action saying that, aren't you going to understand that thousands upon thousands of people just in BC alone had to bear the elements just to get produce because the grocery prices are so high, because inflation, because of high cost of living is making it unaffordable to even feed people here in Canada? Is that not concerning? And Chrystia Freeland could not care less about this. Chrystia Freeland in the House of Commons respond with, well, Mr. Speaker, I went to a school in Winnipeg and we fed some kids that they needed nourishment too. I know kids are starving here in Canada, but we went to this school in Winnipeg and we gave them a banana and some bread and some jam. So I feel like I did everything I could, and I should congratulate myself by raising the carbon tax, by making it more unaffordable for people, because that's just the price you have to pay for freedom here in Canada. We have never had it so good. That was an attempt on a Chrystia Freeland impression. Is that good? I don't know. I'll have to work on it. But here's just he marks this to a video here. This is another food bank in Ontario again, and just watch this.
The grim milestone of over 2 million visits to food banks in a single month in 2024. This represents a nearly doubling since 2019, so a 90% increase since 2019, since before the pandemic. It took us 30 years to get to 1 million visits a month, and then we stayed steady. And then it took us 5 years to double. So we're seeing a rate of growth we've never seen in food banks before since we began in the early 1980s. We've been in constant crisis since 2020.
Just on the Canadian economy, we have had some good news over the summer. Inflation has now been within the Bank of Canada's target range for 7 months in a row at 2.5% in July. That was a 40-month low. The Bank of Canada has now cut interest rates 3 times in a row, and the Bank of Canada was the first G7 country to cut interest rates the first time, the first G7 country to cut them a second time, and the first G7 country to cut them a third time. Wages have been outpacing inflation for 18 months in a row. And that is really good news for Canadian families. It means they bring home more in their paychecks. And the IMF is forecasting that Canada will have the strongest GDP growth in 2025.
But it didn't. But hey, good news. It's glad to know that Chrystia Freeland, her pearl necklace is never more brighter. That's the only thing I can take away from that, because all the rhetoric that she said about, oh, well, inflation is going to the target rate of the Bank of Canada, and it's never better than for Canadian families because they're bringing in more home from their paychecks, and that's going to go towards, benefiting the best of the best, on top of, high taxes, on top of carbon taxes when they can't afford, to fill up their gas tanks to go to work, let alone feeding their kids, putting a roof over their heads, heating their homes, all sorts of stuff. And on top of the fact that this is just statistics among just Canadians, as we're bringing in more and more outsiders, as we're bringing in more foreigners and exploiting them for temporary foreign worker needs, and even them are going towards food banks. So if we can't even succeed in measures to help just Canadians that are already here, how are you going to expect people to react when you're trying to bring in more people into this country just to your agenda that you can't even exceed the needs of the people that are already here? That's what people in Springfield, Ohio, were struggling with. They're already in huge impacts that affect the majority of that population, and you want to bring in more people that for a city that's underserved to its own people. So that's insane. That 90% over 5 years. So here's Merritt Stiles, and this is the official opposition in Ontario here. This is the official opposition to Doug Ford, the premier, leader of the NDP, and she calls out Doug Ford because Ontario being the worst of the worst when it comes to the mass increase at food bank usage. And she's going to call out this. She says food bank use is at an all-time high for working people. It's up to 40% from last year, but this government wants to find ways to make cuts to the ODSP, which is the Ontario Disabilities Act, which is throwing to Doug Ford, trying to eliminate that. But it's okay because that money's going towards, building a whole new Ontario Center at Science Center on Ontario Place that no one really asked or deemed that was necessary. But here's what she said here.
Last week, City News revealed that the government transition binder for the new Minister of Children, Community and Social Services refers to the new federal Canadian Disability Benefit as a way to, quote, mitigate costs for the province. People are living through seriously tough times, and this government is looking to cut funds to the programs that the most vulnerable people in our communities rely on. ODSP maxes out at just $1,300 a month.
Shameful.
Just $1,300 to cover housing, utilities, and food in the middle of a housing and affordability crisis. Food bank use is at an all-time high for working people. It's up 40% from last year. The federal benefit was always supposed to be a top-up to the provincial program to help people make ends meet. Yet the Conservatives, they want to use it as an excuse to make more cuts. We need urgent action to end legislated poverty, Speaker. To the Premier, will you commit to doubling the ODSP today?
So she made a statement at Queen's Park. I don't see it going far. Especially with 2 glasses of water and the 2 books there. For some reason that's all I was paying attention to. The fact that, one person has 2 glasses of water. I guess one of them is to throw at the opposition. Maybe it's one of those things like, how dare you, sir? But in true essence of this, yes, the province does bear a bit of responsibility, but it does form in the face of the federal government because really this is the spiral down of the economy in Canada, and how because of Justin Trudeau, because of Chrystia Freeland, because of these politicians and their negligence on Canadian people and the matters that issue to most Canadian families, they're the ones that are destroying the country within. And when you don't have the ability to just feed people considering the fact that we have housing crisis, we have crisis on crime, we have a crisis on inflation, crisis on cost of living, on top of everything else. You can't even do the bare minimum of making sure that Canadians are fed to last another day. The nation is crumbling. That's going to look bad for the nation. It's not going to be healthy for the nation, and you won't have a nation anytime left the more you keep this going. And considering the fact that NATO wants us to gear up for war, NATO wants us to gear up for World War III. How's that going to look when Canadians can't even feed themselves in their own nation, and you want them on the front lines of war? We're not going to have good soldiers then if they're starving. You're gonna put them onto the front lines and starve them on an overseas nation? Just how crazy that is. So that's the provincial response. Now here is the federal response. And as this guy points out, Terry MC points out, meanwhile, at question period, hey, citizens of Canada, what's in your wallets? Obviously not much, that's for sure. Over 2 million citizens of Canada required the services of a food bank monthly. Thanks to Justin Trudeau, Canadians have never had it so good. And one of the ministers, one of the MPs of the Conservative Party is going to call out Justin Trudeau for this. Listen to that.
Mr. Speaker, life has never been so hard for Canadians after 9 years of this NDP Liberal government. A shocking report out today confirmed there is now more than 2 million Canadians relying on food bank every month just to survive. Many of these food banks regularly run out of food because of skyrocketing demand, with lines stretching for blocks. This Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. His failed agenda has forced people into choosing between paying rent, heating their homes, or putting food on the table. And the Liberals have only made it worse by increasing the carbon tax by 23%. With plans to quadruple it and force even more Canadians to go hungry. Canadians may not be well fed, Mr. Speaker, but they are fed up. This Prime Minister must call a carbon tax election now.
So there's a lot to be said about how devastating this looks, and the rest of the world is taking note on this. Mind you, the rest of the world is also in this detrimental pain. A lot of it has to do with the fact of our reckless spending with Ukraine, with Israel, the fact that we're aiding genocide, we're aiding this illegal proxy war that's slaughtering millions of people overseas, and yet here we are starving our own people. Does not look good. Also, the fact that we are cracking down on, we're putting diminishing farmers and agriculture because we want to keep the monopolies afloat. We showed the video of the dairy farmer in Sarnia that when they overproduce milk and they overproduce their dairy product, instead of what regular businesses would do if they produce more product, they would sell it at a cheaper rate to try to sell off that inventory. They were told to dump out the milk. They were told to dump out the milk. The farmers tried to negotiate, saying, hey, we'll sell it at a cheaper rate, we'll donate it, we don't want this to go to waste. And obviously you don't want it to go to waste. But because monopolies that own agriculture, food industries, grocery store chains, all this, they want to keep those prices at a certain percent, they were telling the farmers to go dump out the extra. So we're diminishing farmers and agriculture. We're wasting money on the bloodshed of these reckless wars. And we're also taxation the hell out of individuals for no real reason or no real regard. Because if you bother to ask what the carbon tax is for or where it's going towards, they don't tell you what's going on. There's no accountability to exactly where the carbon taxes are going towards. They're going to tell you that, well, it's because, we got to use it for green energy projects. Well, not a lot of it's being built, if you haven't noticed. This carbon tax has been around for a couple of years now. They collected millions and billions of dollars off the work of hardworking Canadians, and that money is not being invested in Canada, that's for sure. So where's that money going towards? And paying more to reduce the carbon doesn't exactly sound scientific to me. But what is dastardly, what is a scientific factor, is that the more you starve your own people, the more your entire country, and to even the people in the House of Commons here, is going to deflect into complete apocalyptic atrocity. Like, this is the bare minimum requirement of running a nation. And if you can't even meet those needs, the needs of survival of your own Canadians, then brace yourself, because that's when people get really angry and pissed off. And rightfully so. 2 million people a month are using food banks. And not using food banks in the means of using a food bank, which is supposed to be an emergency for people that are in dire needs to get back on their feet. They are desperate, so desperate, so much poverty. That's their only hope. And that is devastating, and considering the fact that Chrystia Freeland, Justin Trudeau will lie directly to your faces and tell you that everything's okay. Shows the arrogance, the disregard, and just the lack of empathy that our parliamentarian has on its people.